After a brutal winter battle during World War II, a group of German prisoners of war were transferred to a U.S.-run camp in an area known for its bone-chilling nights. The Americans followed wartime regulations, providing food, medical care, and blankets to the prisoners. But when those blankets were handed out, the reaction was not what the guards expected. The blankets looked thin, almost flimsy, light gray fabric that seemed more symbolic than protective. A few German soldiers exchanged glances before bursting into laughter. One of them, a confident former NCO named Klaus, tossed a blanket onto his bunk and scoffed loudly. "Is this a joke? The Americans think this piece of cloth will keep us warm? In the Wehrmacht, we had real military blankets built for the front lines." Others joined in the laughter, making sarcastic comment about how the Americans were saving all the real warmth for themselves. To them, the U.S. blankets were nothing more than cheap rags. Nearby, Sergeant Thomas Mitchell, one of the guards, overheard the mocking. Instead of getting angry, he simply smirked and said calmly, "You might be surprised. Those blankets do not work the way you expect." The prisoners ignored him. In their minds, American equipment was inferior, and this only confirmed their belief. What they did not know was that the real test was coming with the night, a night colder than anything they had faced in that camp so far, a night that would change how they saw those weak blankets forever. As dusk fell, a harsh wind swept to the camp like razor blades against bare skin. The temperature dropped faster than anyone expected, plunging deep below freezing. Even the Americans tightened their jackets and hurried to finish their rounds. Inside the wooden barracks, the German prisoners settled in. Some still mocked the blankets, choosing to wrap them loosely or even toss them aside, confident their uniforms and pride would carry them through the night. But as midnight approached, the cold became merciless. Breath turned into clouds of frost. Metal bed frames felt like ice. Every gap in the wooden walls funneled freezing air straight into their bones. Klaus shivered slightly, but tried to hide it from the others. "It is just a bit of cold," he muttered through clenched teeth. Beside him, a younger prisoner named Dieter began to tremble uncontrollably. He clutched his arms, teeth chattering. "Klaus, this is not normal. It feels like my chest is freezing inside." Klaus hesitated. He glanced at the thin blanket lying beside him, untouched. Meanwhile, a few prisoners who had wrapped their blankets tightly noticed something unexpected. The fabric seemed to trap heat unusually well. It did not feel heavy like wool, but somehow it reduced heat loss by insulating body warmth more efficiently than they had imagined. By 2 a.m., some who had mocked the blankets began to silently pull them over their bodies. By 3 a.m., others who refused to adapt were shaking violently. By 4 a.m., panic replaced pride. Klaus finally gave in. He wrapped himself in the blanket and noticed something strange. The cold seemed to stop spreading, as if the material held his remaining body heat like a shield. Across the room, Sergeant Mitchell stepped inside to check the barracks. He saw several prisoners shivering, their pride fading faster than the temperature. Without a word, he simply nodded at the ones using the blankets properly. It was a silent message. "Now you understand." But before the night was over, one prisoner who had refused a blanket fell unconscious from hypothermia. Suddenly, no one was laughing to sunrise. The cold still lingered like a silent enemy. Frost covered the ground outside the barracks, and a thin layer of ice had formed on the windows. The prisoners woke slowly, muscles stiff, breaths heavy. But one bunk remained still. The young prisoner who had stubbornly refused his blanket lay pale and motionless. A medic rushed in with American guards, confirming what most already feared. Severe hypothermia had taken hold during the night. The medic managed to revive him, but barely. His recovery would take days. The room fell silent. No one dared to speak a word about weak American blankets anymore. Klaus sat on his bunk, fully wrapped in the gray fabric he had mocked just hours earlier. His face was unreadable. Pride had cracked. Sergeant Mitchell entered quietly, hand behind his back. His voice was calm, without a trace of arrogance. "Those blankets," he said, "were not made to look impressive. They are made with a special thermal weave. They trap radiant body heat and prevent moisture buildup. They are designed for nights just like this one." No one interrupted. Mitchell glanced around at the prisoners. Mocking something does not make it weak, he added. Sometimes what you underestimate ends up saving your life. Klaus looked down, gripping the blanket tighter. As the day wore on, prisoners who had once laughed now folded their blankets with quiet respect, not because they were forced to, but because they had finally understood their value. That night, no one hesitated. Every blanket was used. Every soldier, regardless of their past pride, wrapped themselves tightly, not just against the cold, but against the memory of what almost happened. And from that night on, no one ever called them weak. Again, in the days that followed, the harsh cold continued, but the mood in the barracks had changed completely. The German prisoners no longer mocked the supplies given to them. Instead, they treated the blankets with quiet appreciation, almost reverence. Klaus, once the loudest skeptic, now helped younger prisoners wrap theirs correctly, making sure every fold was tight around the shoulders and chest. One evening, as Sergeant Mitchell passed by the barracks, Klaus approached him. His voice was low but sincere. "I did not understand," he admitted. "I judged before knowing. Your blankets, they saved us." Mitchell simply nodded and replied, "Surviving war is not just about strength. It is about recognizing what keeps you alive, even when it does not look impressive." That night, as the barracks settled into silence beneath the icy wind, Klaus lay awake for a moment, staring at the simple gray fabric in his hands. He realized something deeper. Sometimes the greatest strength hides behind simplicity. Sometimes survival depends not on pride, but on listening. And so, a group of men who once laughed at what they thought was weakness learned a powerful truth. Never underestimate what you do not understand, because in the end, what you mock today might be what saves you tomorrow. Over the next week, the cold showed no mercy. Each night was a test of endurance, not just of the body, but of mentality. Yet now, the prisoners were prepared. They no longer saw the U.S. blankets as a joke. They saw them as a lifeline. Dieter, the younger prisoner who trembled on that first freezing night, gradually regained his strength. He often looked at Klaus with quiet gratitude. After surviving the shock of hypothermia, he now wrapped himself tightly in the blanket every evening, whispering a silent prayer of thanks, not for comfort, but for survival. Klaus himself had changed. Once fueled by arrogance, he now carried a calm seriousness. He did not speak much, but when he did, others listened. He checked on the men during cold spells, making sure no one made the same mistake they had that first night. One evening, as the guards made their rounds, a moment of understanding passed silently between captor and captive. Sergeant Mitchell paused briefly at the doorway of the barracks and saw every prisoner already bundled up correctly, no longer resisting what kept them alive. He said nothing, but he nodded once. From his bunk, Klaus saw the gesture and nodded back. It was not a gesture of surrender, nor obedience. It was respect, one soldier to another. The war outside still raged. Allegiances had not changed. But in that frozen world, a quiet truth remained. Survival united them more than flags ever could. What started as mockery had become a lesson, and that lesson would stay with them long after the ice melted and the war was over. Years passed. The war ended. Nations rebuilt. Uniforms were folded away, buried, or left to dust in quiet attics. Klaus returned home, not as a fiery, confident soldier he once was, but as a quieter man shaped by battles, loss, and moments he could never forget. Yet out of all the chaos and destruction he had witnessed, one memory stayed sharp in his mind. That frozen American camp and a thin gray blanket that had once been a joke. It was strange, he often thought. He had survived shelling, gunfire, and night raids. But one of the most defining moments of his survival was not a battle at all. It was a night spent in silence, holding warmth that he had first rejected. He remembered the day before his repatriation, when he found a brief moment alone with Sergeant Thomas Mitchell. Klaus had hesitated before speaking, unsure if a prisoner should address a guard personally. But Mitchell had stood still, waiting. "I used to believe strength was about weapons, ranks, orders," Klaus had said quietly. "But that night, I realized strength can look humble. It can be something as simple as a blanket." Mitchell had studied him for a moment, then replied, "Real strength is not loud. It does not always march or shout. Sometimes it is silent, waiting for you to understand it. Klaus had nodded, unable to find the right words to say goodbye. When he was finally escorted out of camp, he turned one last time, watching the guards from a distance. He never forgot Mitchell's calm eyes. Now, years later, as a civilian, Klaus often sat by his window during winter nights, holding a folded gray blanket he had kept, not a trophy, but a reminder that survival sometimes comes from the things we underestimate, and that respect can grow in the coldest places. The years settled into quiet routine. Klaus built a modest life, far from the noise of war. He married, became a father, and eventually a grandfather. But even as the world around him modernized, cars faster, cities louder, some winters still felt as sharp as that one night in the camp. One particularly cold evening, Klaus sat near the fireplace with his grandson, a curious boy named Lucas who loved asking questions about the past. He had recently learned about the war in school and wanted to know what his grandfather had experienced. "Opa, were you afraid during the war?" Klaus hesitated. Like many former soldiers, he avoided discussing the darker parts. But he saw curiosity in the boy's eyes, not bloodlust, but a desire to understand. So he stood up, walked to a wooden chest, and carefully took out something wrapped in cloth. Inside was that same gray blanket. Lucas frowned. "It is just a blanket." Klaus smiled gently. "That is what I thought once." He sat beside the boy and began telling the story, not of guns or enemies or victories, but of cold survival and a lesson in humility. He told Lucas about the night they mocked the blankets, and how silence replaced laughter when the cold came. Lucas listened intently, no longer seeing a piece of fabric, but a symbol of life and wisdom. When the story ended, Klaus placed the blanket gently on his grandson's lap. "Never mock what you do not understand," he said softly. "Strength can hide in simple things." Lucas nodded, running his hand across the fabric, as if trying to feel the history within it. Outside, the winter wind howled against the window, but inside, warmth remained, carried not just by the fire, but by a lesson that would never fade. In war, men often believe strength is measured by steel, rank, or pride. But for Klaus and many others, a single freezing night revealed a different truth. A thin gray blanket, mocked for being weak, became a symbol of survival. A silent American sergeant showed that true strength does not always shout. And a once arrogant soldier learned that survival often begins the moment we choose humility over ego. Years later, as that same blanket rested in the hands of a wide-eyed grandson, it carried more than warmth. It carried a message across generations. Never underestimate the quiet things. Never mock what you do not yet understand. And never assume weakness just because strength does not look as you expect. For in the deadliest cold, it was not pride that saved them. It was what they once laughed at. It was many years later, when the winter came unusually harsh again. Lucas, now a teenager, stood by the window one evening, watching snow fall in thick silence. Klaus, older and slower now, sat in his armchair near the fireplace, the familiar gray blanket folded neatly across his lap. Suddenly, the power went out. The house went dark and cold crept in quickly. Lucas hurried to gather candles while Klaus remained calm, waiting patiently. "Opa, what do we do?" Lucas asked, slight worry in his voice. Klaus quietly unfolded the blanket and placed it over both their shoulders as they sat together near the fading warmth of the fire. "We stay warm, we stay patient, and we do not fear what we understand," he said gently. Lucas rested beside him, the memory of the story returning in full weight. The blanket no longer felt like an ordinary piece of fabric. It felt like protection carried through time. After a moment of silence, Lucas looked at his grandfather. "You kept this all these years because it saved you, right?" Klaus nodded slowly. "Yes, but I also kept it so it could save someone again, perhaps not from the cold outside, but from believing pride is stronger than wisdom." Lucas did not say anything more, but he leaned closer, accepting the warmth, not just of the blanket, but of understanding. In that quiet, powerless house, as the wind howled across the frozen landscape, there was no panic, only calm. The cold was still powerful, but the lesson was stronger. Time moved forward, as it always does. One final winter came, the coldest one Lucas could remember. By then, Klaus was frail, his steps slower, his voice softer. Yet he still sat by the window whenever snow fell, watching it with the same calm he had learned long ago in that distant camp. One morning, Lucas found a gray blanket carefully folded at the foot of Klaus's bed, along with a small handwritten note. It read, "Strength is not always seen. Sometimes it is felt in moments of fear, silence, and survival. When the world grows cold, remember this. Not all protection looks powerful. Keep this and keep the lesson." Klaus. That evening, the old man passed away peacefully in his sleep, wrapped in quiet dignity, just as he had lived in his final years. At the funeral, Lucas did not speak of battles or victories. He spoke of a night in a prison camp when a group of soldiers laughed at a blanket, and how that same blanket helped save lives. He spoke of humility, of survival, and of a quiet American sergeant whose lesson carried across generations. He ended with the same words Klaus once whispered by the fire. Never underestimate what looks weak. Sometimes, the simplest things hold the greatest strength. Many winters later, Lucas kept the blanket safely stored. But every once in a while, when the night was especially cold, he would unfold it, not just for warmth, but to remember a man who survived a deadly freeze and shared its lesson with the world. And so, a thin gray blanket became more than fabric. It became a legacy, a quiet symbol of how wisdom can outlast war, and how strength can live on in silence. Years passed. Lucas grew older, just as his grandfather once did. The world continued to change, wars ended, new ones threatened to begin, and technology replaced many old things. But some lessons never fade. As an adult, Lucas became a history teacher. Not because he wanted to glorify war, but because he wanted to teach what it truly meant to survive one. He rarely spoke of weapons or strategies. Instead, he spoke of people, moments, and choices. One day, during a harsh winter, he brought a folded gray blanket into his classroom and placed it carefully on his desk. The students were puzzled. "What is that?" one asked. Lucas smiled softly. "It is a reminder that strength is not always about force. Sometimes it is about recognizing what keeps you alive, even when it looks simple." And so he told him the story, not with guns or explosion, but with silence, cold wind, and a lesson learned in humility. He spoke of Klaus, a young soldier who once laughed at something he did not understand, until that very thing helped save his life. As the students listened, the room became quiet. For many of them, this would be the first story about war that did not end with victory or defeat, but with wisdom. At the end of class, one student asked, "Sir, do you still have that blanket?" Lucas nodded. "Yes, and one day, when someone truly needs it, I will pass it on." That night, as snow fell outside his home, Lucas stood by the window, just like his grandfather used to. The blanket lay folded nearby, and for a moment, he swore he could feel Klaus standing beside him, watching the winter peacefully as if saying, "The cold never wins when wisdom is passed on. In war, weapons decide battles. But it is wisdom that decides who survives them." A thin gray blanket, once mocked as useless, became a quiet symbol of life, endurance, and humility. For Klaus, it was a second chance. For Lucas, it became a legacy. And for every soul who hears their story, it is a reminder. Do not laugh at what you do not understand. Do not dismiss what looks small. For in your coldest moments, survival may come wrapped in something you once ignored. Some legacies are not carved in stone. They are passed in silence, held in memory, shared across generations. And sometimes they are folded carefully, waiting for the next frozen night. Because strength does not always roar. Sometimes it is as quiet as a blanket. Decades later, long after Lucas had grown old, a quiet exhibit opened in a small war history museum. It was not dedicated to battles or generals, but to human survival and the lessons born in hardship. Among the artifacts, faded letters, worn boots, dog tags, there was a single glass display. Inside, resting carefully on a wooden platform, was a simple gray blanket. Beside it was a small plaque, "Prison Camp Winter Blanket, Anonymous Survivor," a symbol of humility, survival, and silent strength. Sometimes what we mock becomes what saves us. Visitors often pause there longer than at the more dramatic exhibits. Children ask their parents why a blanket deserved to be protected like a treasure. Some veterans stared at it in silence, eyes reflecting memories they never spoke aloud. A young girl once looked up at her father and asked, "How can a blanket matter more than a weapon?" Her father, who had read the story behind it, replied softly, "Because sometimes surviving is a greater victory than winning." That night, the girl went home and drew a picture, not of soldiers in combat, but of two figures sharing a blanket under a frozen sky. The story continued, whispered not through gunfire or orders, but through quiet moments of understanding. The blanket, though never warm on its own, continued warming hearts. Because even as generations changed, its message remained the same. Do not underestimate the simple things. Do not laugh at what you do not know. Sometimes the greatest strength is the one that keeps you alive quietly while pride freezes in the cold. Many years after the blanket found its place in the museum, a university student named Emily visited the exhibit for a research project. She expected to write about tanks or famous battles, not a simple gray blanket. But when she read the story behind it, something shifted. That night, she couldn't forget the tale of Klaus, Lucas, and the winter that tested pride. So she wrote an article titled, "The Blanket That Taught a Soldier Humility." She published it online as a human interest story, not expecting much. Within days, it spread worldwide. People shared it not because it was a story about war, but because it was a story about humanity. Teachers used it in classrooms to talk about respect. Therapists shared it with those struggling with ego and fear. Parents told it to their children as a lesson in humility. Soldiers in training reflected on it during cold night drills. And people facing their own frozen nights found comfort in its message. Sometimes salvation looks small at first. Soon, someone created a short animated film adaptation that went viral. Comments flooded in from around the globe. "I'll never underestimate quiet strength again. This helped me let go of my pride and accept help. My grandfather survived winter in the army. This made me cry. I needed this reminder today." Decades after a group of prisoners once laughed at a blanket, millions now honored it as a symbol of silent power. And somewhere in a place beyond time and war, Klaus might have smiled, knowing that the lesson he once learned in the cold now warmed countless hearts across the world. The blanket never spoke, but its story did, and in a world that often shouts, a quiet legacy became louder than any battle cry.